Hi, everyone. Hello, dear co-speakers. My name is Denis Cenusa. I'm visiting fellow at the School of Transnational Governance in Florence, and I'm happy to be here in Florence at the STG and organize this event together with my colleagues, Michael Guterbock, who is also a visiting fellow at the School of Transnational Governance, and our special guest, Samuel Doveri Westerby, the Managing Director of European Neighborhood Council, based in Brussels. So today's presentation will be focusing on critical infrastructure. We decided to organize this event and to focus on the topic because of what is happening right now on the European continent. We clearly see that critical infrastructure is becoming the chief topic, I believe, in the policies and the policymaking process in Brussels. And I believe that we have to also dedicate time to look how this policy area is evolving and what is shaping it. So therefore, we will have different angles of our conversation today. We will first of all look into how the Russian aggression against Ukraine has been a trigger for different events that are basically changing the face of critical infrastructure in Ukraine and its proximity. Then we will try to look closer to the more specific elements of critical infrastructure within Ukraine. That's where Michael will dive into the aspects that sometimes are overlooked but are very important related to the healthcare infrastructure. And then we would like to zoom out and look at Ukraine and at the region through bigger lenses and understand what is happening actually at the level of Eurasian continent. And here Samuel will help us um, to map out which are the trends and what we can expect in the future. So that saying, I would like to start with my presentation, which will shed light on what is happening in Ukraine, to Ukraine, but more important to the infrastructure that is a lifeline for the country's economy and political as well as socioeconomic systems, and how this is relevant for the country in Ukraine's proximity. So before jumping into some specific factual data about what happened to Ukrainians' critical infrastructure, I would like to go quickly through some definitions. They are important because we are speaking about critical infrastructure, and I believe that we have to understand what exactly is this. So from what I have been looking at when preparing for this presentation, I came across different notions, but there is no notion that is encompassing like one single meaning for critical infrastructure. So it really depends at what region you're looking at and what definition you would like to employ in order to make it useful for your presentation. We are in Europe. We talk about Ukraine. Ukraine is a EU candidate state, and we have to look at Ukraine's infrastructure through the definitions that the Euro bureaucrats are using. And this is exactly that definition. As you can see, the European Union has been very creative in looking at the critical infrastructure, interpreting it. And why I'm saying that, because I could see that, for instance, this definition, which was first time mentioned in 2008, as incorporated into the EU acquis, it was very much focused, it has the angle of energy security, and it was logical because Ukraine and Russia were having contradictions in the energy sector, and it affected the energy security and energy supply, gas supply to Europe. And then, as you can see, this directive was issued in 2008. It was 2 years after the gas wars between Ukraine and Russia happened. So therefore, this definition is reflecting the times that were, I mean, the urgency of looking at the critical infrastructure through that exact necessity at that moment, at that time. And we exactly can say that critical infrastructure for the EU is plays a function of societal. It is explained through functionality for the society and for different aspects of the society, and therefore they are looking at this exactly through the vital societal functions of the critical infrastructure. And then for them, critical infrastructure is really about disruption, destruction, but not during wartime. It's really the angle of what can happen to these assets, physical assets, during the peacetime. Even if we can assume that probably what was happening back then in 2006 between Ukraine and Russia was a preparatory, stage to what is happening right now when we have a military confrontation. It is still, for the EU back then, it was not clear that this is coming. So they were really shaping a definition that was characteristic for that specific time, which was about energy. So even if they don't mention energy, it's about transport, and energy transport is about transmission, gas transmission pipelines. So a more specific definition that is current for today is this one, and you can see 2022. So it's a fresh take on critical infrastructure that the EU has come up with, and this is exactly because we can see that they are looking at the critical infrastructure through a more holistic lens. It's not only about energy, it's not only about transport, it's about everything. And then exactly, I think that these two definitions show us the evolution of the EU when it comes to how they were conceiving critical infrastructure. And that at the moment in 2022, they really speak about resilience, not just protecting critical infrastructure, but also resilience efforts, which means making it robust for whatever happens to it. Make it adaptable, make it robust, and make it flexible, which is exactly this transition from protecting critical infrastructure to making it resilient to different types of disruption can happen, including those related to war or happening during wartime. So now this graph is really illustrative in showing how diverse is critical infrastructure, and exactly helps us to see this discrepancy between what the EU was thinking critical infrastructure is looking like in 2008, the definition that I showed you with a focus on transport and energy, to what they arrived today in 2022, not today, but still very recently. And we speak at least about 11 sectors, which are now fully integrated in this approach paradigm of critical infrastructure. That's why it's so important to look at this in a holistic way, because they can, if one of these areas is breaking down, then it will create cascading effects for the rest of them. And therefore, the EU, I think now, is more realistic when it comes to the critical infrastructure, especially when we speak about interconnectedness, and that Ukraine is right now trying to use the function of connectivity and interconnections with the EU, which means that the EU has to treat critical infrastructure of Ukraine as part of its own critical infrastructure because of the interdependency that is being created at the moment. So I decided to give this, I think, separate understanding of or a view at critical infrastructure during the wartime and during the obviously peacetime. And peacetime means the absence of a total war. It doesn't mean that we avoid activities like terrorist attacks or other types of disruptions that are local, that can have a short timeline, that are not very complex in the impact that they are producing, because the concept of guards, gates, and guns is a reaction to what happened in 2001 in September in the US, and it was a reaction to the lack of vision about the vulnerability that the critical infrastructure in the US had vis-a-vis non-state actors like terrorist organizations that were targeting vulnerable critical infrastructure because they were not enough protected. So then the US, I think it was the 2001 Patriot Act that is looking at this through this protective lenses. And they decide that more has to be done in order to train, repel, and prevent, as well as collect evidence, do supervision, and prevent any sort of critical infrastructure attacks from happening. And then we see an interesting transition from that very protective measures from that were emerging as a result of what happened in the US, but also in London and in Madrid, all these terrorist attacks that were happening against the members of NATO. I think that was the idea, right? We had a reaction to what the NATO was doing, and then that was a kind of punishment coming from the terrorist organizations to the countries that were part of NATO. And then we have this interesting transition in 2019 towards resilience and resiliency of the critical infrastructure, which has really nothing to do with just protecting, but it's about creating capacities for the critical infrastructure to withstand any sort of disruption, be it coming from man-made actions like terrorist attacks, or as a result of nature-made catastrophes and other sort of events. And I think that this is exactly an interesting transition during the peacetime, right? When we see this very much protective approach towards the critical infrastructure, and then looking at the critical infrastructure as something that has to be taken care of, regardless of what can happen to it. And more, I think that the second approach with resilient critical infrastructure is the more visionary, and it's giving sort of tools for any sort of times, including the wartime that is not foreseen but may happen. But what we see during the wartime at the moment is that what I call re-securitization, because we already have the concept of securitization, which is coming from as a result of the thinking process of the Copenhagen School, which is looking very much into securitization on how the statements and visions on security and how security has to be applied to different, policy areas, including energy or transport or any other part of critical infrastructure, how that should transform into actions, strategies, working plans, and other types of activities that will actually give articulation to the visions into specific actions, which means also providing resources and creating that tangible, result of securitization of security for critical infrastructure. So the re-securitization, it's, from my point of view at the moment, something that is going to be discussed very much, because we talk about instrumentalization of critical infrastructure, weaponization, which is a more, buzzword. And I believe that this is part of the consequences of the war in Ukraine that Russia is waging, which is very much targeting civilian infrastructure, which will be actually discussed by Michael, as well as other types of critical infrastructure for the purpose of war, obviously to win the war against Ukraine, but also in order to shape the security of the security of Europe, to create the new architecture of Europe, is also something that Russia is trying to do while targeting Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Because in my view, what I will show here on this slide, these are elements of Russian military strategy against Ukraine. You can see that they are destroying literally the most important functions of a state like Ukraine, which is a big state. It has to, in order to be sustainable, from the point of view of budgetary incomes and revenues, and then spend that for functioning as a state, they need to have all these areas well oiled and well functioning. At the moment, this is not the case. Therefore, when Michael will speak about the reparation, he will give you a little bit of understanding why this is so important, but from the healthcare angle. In this particular slide, you can see that Russia is following two big objectives. One is, or strategies. One is about constraining Ukraine. So it really destroys this critical infrastructure in order to make Ukraine less capable to recover from war, which means weaker state, which means a more easy target for Russian influence after the war. And then the second function is to make Ukraine lose the war, which means a more operational and more urgent objective that is about having an upper hand and finishing the war as soon as possible in order to reduce the costs for Russia itself. So if the first one about constraining, it's about what Ukraine will look like after the war, how much it will cost the reparation, as well as how much this reparation cost will inflict on the EU on its own budget, as well as the future of European security that we speak about today. The second one, which is a more urgent one, it's about finishing the war so that Russia is not collapsing economically speaking. So here are the final thoughts that I wanted to emphasize. They are about approaches that should be adopted both for the peace and wartime. It's related to Ukraine, obviously, but it's a more general approach that should be integrated into the EU understanding of how the post-war critical infrastructure of Ukraine and of the EU should look like. And the first one, obviously, it's about restoration function. It's not just about the future of Ukraine; it's about the present. If the country is not benefiting from this support to survive the current winter, I think that this might be the last winter of Ukraine being capable to withstand Russian aggression. We know very well that up to 40% of energy infrastructure of Ukraine is either not repairable or it's fully destroyed. This is a lot for a country that has to run its industrial capacities complex in order to produce this defensive capacities, as well as keeping the population safe and minimally happy with the living conditions so that they don't create a new wave of refugees for the EU, with all these repercussions for the political stability within the EU and the member states, where we can see now more far-right political parties are winning important weight in the decision-making process. Czech Republic is the last country where you have like far-right, let's say, skeptically oriented political party of Babiš that has a very specific opinion about Ukraine, being against Ukrainian, integration into the EU. Then we also have the importance of the function of interconnectivity. The EU still has to make sure that Ukraine is integrated, but considering that all this integration and interconnection is creating dependencies for the EU itself, so it should be also re-securitization of the EU approach when it comes to developing this new grid interconnection at the level of electricity or gas interconnection, because we have new capacities of Russia to target them, and they are conducted usually at the moment through drones and other capacities of similar nature. So if the EU is going to invest in interconnectivity, it has to also deal with this aspect. Then the connectivity, which is also important for Ukraine, and I think it will be something that both the Ukrainians as well as the NATO member states will have to take care of, because at the moment, for instance, the US Starlink connections and terminals that are introduced into Ukraine, they are paid by Poles and by the Americans. So the Ukrainians don't have these resources to take care of this, meaning that If the EU is not helping Ukraine to be strong in having alternative sources of internet connections, and it will rely or continue to rely on US Starlink, then there should be also budget for this, especially in the period of reconstruction operation where there will be a very big, stress on Ukrainian budget as well as on its partners. And then last but not least is obviously the resecuritization, which is about developing new protection techniques against drones. They are very much already in place in Ukraine. I think that Ukraine is becoming a pioneer in this regard. There are different ways to, for instance, they are protecting the checkpoints through nets that are creating basically channels for transport that is going through checkpoints or railway stations against drones, plus the jamming systems that are also tested by Ukrainians against Russian drones. So I think that all these approaches, they are all at certain point they are already in place. If not, then they are in the pipeline. And I assume that if we discuss more about critical infrastructure, which is one of the goals of this event, it's we can also help to guide the conversation towards looking at the critical infrastructure as an important element of the European energy, not just energy, but in general security architecture that we are going to build after the war in Ukraine ends. And here I will stop and I will pass the mic to Michael so that he tells us more about critical infrastructure from a very, very particular angle, which is healthcare sector. Thank you, Michael.